That is a highly controversial topic.
It's not quite moral, but it is a theological explanation.
The idea of like apocalyptic literature is not that it's to be interpreted in necessarily a literal sense.
Yeah, I'm impressed by your very thorough research.
I just started thinking about this because, as you might imagine, nobody's ever asked me in church about Judas.
That's a fascinating philosophical discussion.
I think it's important to talk to them and find out what they believe. Hello, everyone. Thanks again to those who are helping out on Patreon. The links are here and down below in the thingy. Once again, the questions are marked out on the YouTube timeline, so if there's a question in which you have a particular interest, feel free to skip ahead. Unfortunately, in this episode, I had a co-host who, she didn't talk much and just stared directly into the camera. So, sorry baby, I had to edit you out. I hope you enjoyed the interview, and make sure you stick around for the end where I talk about two things you probably don't know. Hello and welcome to the What They Believe series. Today my guest is Reverend Matt Seddon of the Trinity Episcopal Church in Bloomington, Indiana. Thank you for joining us, Reverend.
You're welcome. Glad to be here.
So were you born into the Episcopal Church or did you convert?
I was born into the church. My grandfather was an Episcopal priest, and my maternal grandmothers and great-grandmothers were organists in their Episcopal churches, and my father was taught for most of his teaching career. He was a high school teacher. He taught at Episcopal boarding schools and day schools. So I come by it fairly legitimately and was pretty immersed in it.
And why did you become a pastor? Was it just a family business, or did you feel a calling at some point?
You know, I did always love church as a kid. I was a very pious kid. I served as an acolyte, which is sort of an assistant during the worship service, maybe carrying a candle or the cross or swinging incense or something like that. But I always wanted to be an archaeologist, really, from my earlier ages. And so that's what I pursued for, 20 years, really, until my late 30s, early 40s. Just started getting a feeling that I wasn't doing everything that I'd been put on the earth to do. Couldn't put my finger on it. It was just sort of like an uncomfortable unease that wouldn't go away. I had a great time being an archaeologist, but I got to figure out what I am called to be, and I definitely want to integrate my faith with that. The simplest way I could put it would be that when I would finally go, okay, maybe I am called to be a priest, because a bunch of other people were saying that to me. Middle age, I guess I had a midlife crisis and didn't end up with a car. I went to seminary instead.
Do you have a favorite passage from Scripture?
The one that really leaps to my mind is John 10:10. And Jesus says, I have come that they might have life and have it abundantly. That's actually, I would call that my exegetical key, right? So anytime you're trying to interpret, do exegesis on a text, including the Bible, especially one that's as complicated as the Bible, by multiple authors over spanning centuries, you generally need like something you use as kind of your lens, your key, this is the kind of touchstone I use for interpreting, and I would say John 10:10 is that one for me.
Do you believe that we are currently in the end times?
As the end times are classically defined and defined by a lot of Christians today, particularly people who might read the Bible fairly literally, or in a way that makes sense to them and now. So what we're talking about is close to the second coming of Jesus, and there's going to be portents in the earth and this and that, and we're about to have all the stuff in the book of Revelation happen and things like that. The simple answer is no. I don't. Although I've been taken for a long time by a particular approach to eschatology, or end times kind of study, what the end of the world, the end of time, from a branch of theology called process theology, is a notion that, well, maybe the world is sort of always ending and always beginning at the same time. So we do look around and we see things come to an end, and we see, well, people die, ways of life disappear, ways of doing things go away. But at the same time, we see newness of life springing up and new things coming into existence. And that is, I mean, to me, that's resurrection. And to me, in a sense, that is new beginnings. So I might also say, yeah, sure. Just we are and we will be. Christians have been trying to put a date on that for 2,000 plus years, and the track record isn't very good. So like, I wouldn't even engage in that.
1 Corinthians 14, the Bible says that women should not speak in church, going as far as to call this act disgraceful. What is your position on the role of women in church?
Anybody who is baptized, regardless of sex, gender, identity, whatever, has all the authority they need, all the commissioning they need to serve in any role in the church, from the simplest acolyte role, which is usually carting around the incense behind the person swinging the smoke. That's the one you usually give to the smallest acolyte because it's simple. From that on up to bishop, anybody. And so that, I mean, obviously completely includes women. I don't use that Corinthians text as like a proof text for who should serve and who shouldn't in church. Would you like to hear more about why that is?
Certainly.
I assume that was the follow-up, like, hey, don't you read the Bible? It says it pretty clearly right there.
It also, I wish I could remember the passage, but there's a deacon named Phoebe that's mentioned.
That's very true. She's not the only female church leader thanked by Paul in his letters. There's quite a number of women mentioned who very clearly were playing leadership roles in Paul's churches. Sometimes early scribes would actually change their names in copying manuscripts to make them masculine. But the most ancient manuscripts didn't. And so we know that for a fact. So that actually makes that comment in 1 Corinthians 14 really odd. Why would Paul say that when he simultaneously thanks Phoebe for being a deacon? We don't quite know what deacons were doing in Paul's churches, but I strongly suspect they talked from time to time. So there's actually a pretty good argument that passage itself is a scribal emendation, that a later scribe inserted that into the text. And I'd have to go look it up, but I think it might not even be in the earliest copies that we have of 1 Corinthians. So now the tricky part of that is like, who's copying off of the better copy? The later manuscripts that you have or the earlier manuscripts? Because we know there were like schools of manuscripts, but I wouldn't hang, period. I wouldn't hang like permitting or denying anyone the right to serve God and God's people based on one line out of one part of the Bible, right? Because you do that, and I shouldn't, because I'm wearing polyester cotton, which is completely forbidden in Leviticus. So, there you have it. So I think you have to have construct a more nuanced theology than just looking at a single passage.
The name Judas is used as a pejorative in modern parlance, but I think that unfairly maligns Judas Iscariot. As I understand it, if Jesus wasn't sacrificed, then no one's sins are forgiven and no one gets to go to heaven. And since this was prophesied, Judas, it seems, didn't really have a choice whether or not to betray Jesus. So shouldn't Judas be, if not revered, at least treated with a little more compassion?
Oh, I would say so. I mean, Judas has at various times and places. There definitely have been times and places in the Christian tradition where, Judas is never called a saint, but where that role that Judas played in that drama is recognized and respected. The whole sort of betrayal, passion, suffering, and resurrection story is shot through with these aspects of inevitable, not inevitable. The story is told slightly different ways, in each of the Gospels. John kind of portrays Jesus in charge of the whole thing, more or less, from beginning to end, more or less. Whereas if you look at Mark, probably the earliest Gospel written, Mark's kind of attitude is this is more of a total travesty of justice from beginning to end. There's this mix of cosmic, divine purpose and human fallibility, and it's all pulled together into a really complicated mix of ideas. There's a non-canonical manuscript called early Christian manuscript called the Gospel of Judas, which more or less makes the argument you just made. So it's definitely an idea that's out there, and you've made a good argument. And also, I might say too, like, well, if we're going to be beating on Judas, we should be beating on Peter too, because, you know, that abandonment, it's almost the hinge point of the story. Actually, if you look at, this is a nerdy fact, if you look at Bach's Mass in B minor, or no, the Passion of St. Matthew, that is the hinge point, is Peter's betrayal. It's like halfway through the Mass. And, you know, this is supposedly Jesus's best friend, or at least one of his major leaders who he really cares about, who just said, I'll never leave you. And then Jesus says, yeah, you're gonna. And then he does, you know. And then not just Peter, but think of all the rest of the male disciples, all of whom just took off, you know, out of fear for being hung up on a cross too, whereas the women didn't. And so, you know, I would say there's a lot of betrayal in the story, and not just Judas. But you're right, his is the most dramatic, and, you know, so if you got to look for a bad guy in the story, then, you know, you can pick Judas if you want. But, you know, you got all kinds of people not behaving in loving ways in that story.
I personally enjoy, you know, because there's two different accounts of it. Either he hung himself, or he bought some land, walked out into the middle of the field, and exploded. Yeah, I'd love for that to be in one of the biblical movies.
Yeah, right. Or we could enact it on Good Friday in the liturgy or something like that.
Okay, this was anecdotal, but I've spoken to quite a few pastors whose denominations are experiencing schisms. Most currently, it was Methodists, but this has been going on with the Southern Baptists and Lutherans. Setting aside why these schisms are happening, what are your personal feelings about them? Is it like disagreeing with a neighbor,
closer
or like
to the
being
latter,
estranged from a family member?
I would say even more tragic and more serious. So, I mean, I'm not trying to criticize the churches that are going through this, because it's super painful, and we as Episcopalians have too, right? When we consecrated an openly gay and partner bishop of New Hampshire, Gene Robinson, about 10% of the Episcopal Church left the Episcopal Church. And a large proportion of the global Anglican communion was really mad. And in fact, they're still really mad. And tried to find ways to kick us out of the communion, only to discover that we don't have a mechanism for that in the communion. We're a little more loosey-goosey in our structure. But, you know, Jesus says quite clearly, you know, you shall be one, as I and the Father are one. And he says that very specifically to his disciples. And so I really think, I mean, any of our various splits as Christians, if you go back to the Great Schism of 1054, the sort of the Eastern and Western Church, any of the Reformation breakaways, including my church. And then, you know, from within those, we've had various and sundry others. They're, I mean, at some level sinful, I would say, that that we cannot carry out that one command of Jesus is, I think, a real tragedy. Now, listening to the stories, you know, I can kind of understand, like I can understand these on a human level. Certainly the one we went through. Sometimes you reach some points where worshiping together because it's different ideas you have about what's going on there and what it means and what you're celebrating, that could be very hard. I really wish that we as Christians overall could maybe rethink what we mean by being one, actually. I mean, maybe there is a way to do that. So I think of the sort of the Anglican Roman Catholic break, and there's a committee that has been working on bringing us back together for decades. A while back, we came to an agreement that we all agreed on the Blessed Virgin Mary and what she meant. And so they're working on this, right? But I'd be the first to admit that, like, the fact that we have women priests could be a challenge in terms of like being completely united as a church. So for example, the Episcopal Church is in full communion with the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which essentially means we recognize each other as being the same church, but it has some practical applications. I can walk into an ELCA church and serve as the priest for a service, and they can do that to mine. In fact, I'm talking with the one here in town about doing a pulpit swap so that people could hear different things for a change, right? We can do that without even asking permission. That might be hard for the Roman Church, right? But maybe there's another way we can be one, right? Could we at least take communion together? But my own communion, the Anglican Communion, just had a meeting of all the bishops called the Lambeth Conference, where they call together every single bishop in the Anglican Communion to England, to Lambeth Palace, the Archbishop of Canterbury's digs. And a bunch of people wouldn't take communion because the Episcopal Church has openly gay bishops or women bishops, and some of the other bishops wouldn't take communion with that. It's just heartbreaking to me, angering too. And so, I think we got to think hard about what being one is, because it's definitely not going to be we agree on everything. But maybe we could think carefully about, can we agree on what it means to be a follower of Jesus, and then look for that in each other.
This is going to sound like a joke.
Yeah.
But I've heard this my entire life, and I've never heard a member of the clergy actually try to answer this pedant question.
Okay.
Can God create a rock so heavy that he could not lift it?
Oh, I love this sort of thing. Like how many angels can dance on the head of a pin kind of questions. How could God create a rock so heavy that even God can't lift it? Part of me kind of goes, why would we ask that question? Why are we curious about? I mean, I think obviously what's going on is this question of God's absolute power. Basically, it's a way of asking questions about that absolute power, right? The power to create, the power to do anything. Like I could see hardcore Calvinists getting really tied up in that question, because Calvinism very much is based on a central notion of God's absolute control over every single thing in the universe. I'd be curious how John Calvin would have answered that. He probably would have said, "Oh, get out of here. Get out of my church. That's not a very interesting question." You are not chosen. That's pretty clear. So I think of God's power in a very different way. So I might say that God doesn't really work like that. So God is involved in creation, but has created a very free creation. Such that I don't see God reaching into creation and picking up rocks. I know some people do, right? I'm sure that they've got biblical warrants for that, and things like that. But I have biblical warrants too to sort of suggest, that I don't think God relates to creation in the sense of like moving chess pieces around, picking up rocks. I think, God gave a lot of freedom to creation. And so the rocks that appear in creation, I would suspect that God celebrates joyfully that they appeared of their own, of the processes of the universe that God created. So, it's an interesting philosophical conundrum, right? And it's essentially unanswerable in that regard. But I think it does stir up questions about what do we mean about God's absolute power, which I do think you have to think about a lot, since we Christians, and a lot of us in this tradition, Judeo-Christian tradition, we insist that God is engaged with the world, right? So that is really, you were talking about Christmas. The Luke story of Christmas goes to great lengths to establish Jesus in history, right? In the time of the emperor, blah, 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 during this, when so-and-so was procurator of such and such in Syria, and blah, blah, blah. Now he kind of gets some of the dates wrong, but it's situating Jesus in history. God is acting in history. That's a conviction that we have. It's why we've never been fond of the theology of deism, of God sort of creating the clock, winding it up and walking away, because it just doesn't fit our notion of God's real engagement with history. In a world of science, that becomes a very tricky question. How does God do that without violating the laws of science, for example, right? And so I think to deal with that question, you have to really think carefully about what you mean by power. And power can mean the ability to pick up a rock or to tell somebody to pick up a rock. I might call that coercion or force. And that power stems more from the conditions under which, if someone told me to pick up a rock, I would say, oh yeah, that person can tell me to pick up a rock and I'm going to. And so I don't think God operates with that kind of coercive power. But that's me. So that was a long, stumbling, that is not a question I even get during coffee hours. I definitely get is my dog going to go to heaven? Things like that, stuff we've never talked about in seminary, by the way. But nobody has asked me that one. So good question.
I prefer the Simpsons version. Can God microwave a burrito so hot he could not eat it? I'd like to thank Reverend Seddon for talking with me here today, and I shall do so now. Thank you, Reverend.
Hey, thank you. It was a fun conversation.
Here's the thing. A famous clown once said, "Kent, the young people today, they think comedy is dirty words. It's not. It's words that sound dirty, like mukla." Well, let's talk about some of those. I really enjoy vanilla cream soda, but I don't think I've had a buttload in my lifetime. A buttload is a real measurement, equaling 108 gallons. Balls to the wall has nothing to do with testicles. And if you think about the logistics of that, it should be obvious. On some airplanes, the throttle and fuel regulator would have a ball on the end, and putting the ball to the wall would make the plane go faster. It's the airplane equivalent of putting the pedal to the metal. This last one is something my parents would say. They would refer to an object or a situation as going to pot, which I had assumed had something to do with spending money on drugs. Instead, it's about stew. Before refrigeration was popular or even available, you would eat foods while they were fresh, and when they would start to rot, you would add them to the stew pot. It would decay and then go to pot. Here's the thing. By all accounts, Talmadge Attridge Jr. was a good pilot. In fact, he was a test pilot, which is an extra level of awesome. At age 33, he was test piloting an F-11 Tiger when his plane was struck by several 20mm bullets. He was over the Atlantic and his engine had been hit. He managed to get over land and within a mile of the runway when his engine gave out. The plane crashed, and despite his serious injuries, he managed to get out of the wreckage, which was currently on fire and had live ammunition. Talmadge Attridge Jr. died 41 years later. Despite a broken leg and 3 crushed vertebrae, he was back flying the plane 6 months later. But who shot him down? This was 1956, and the United States was not currently at war. Well, let me show you with some crappy effects using a knockoff transformer and MS Paint. Atteridge was flying at over 800 miles an hour, test-fired the Tiger's cannons, and then went into a controlled dive. The rounds from the cannon travel at more than 2,000 miles per hour, but not forever. The gravity from the Earth and the friction from the ocean air changed the velocity and the trajectory. Thomas Atteridge Jr. was shot down by Thomas Atteridge Jr. Thanks for watching, and may the road rise with you.
And I mean, another way I sometimes put it is I got much more interested in living communities than in dead ones. Although the dead ones were pretty interesting too. So.